Ever cut someone off and never looked back? Right, I did, if so.
She raised her glass like a queen christening a warship and said she had one little surprise, and before I could finish my laugh at the timing, which I admit was half a nervous tick and half a prayer, my sister tilted her head with that bright toothpaste commercial smile and announced that she was pregnant, then added, with a stage whisper she knew would carry, that she was so sorry if this steals the spotlight again, which told every person in that room exactly what she meant for it to do. And I stood there in the middle of my own engagement party, holding a flute of warm Prosecco, while the center of the room moved 3 steps to my left and never came back. The sound that followed was not pure joy. It was the messy blend that families make when kindness and competition share a plate, laughter and whooping, phones out, a few giddy tears, that aunt who always narrates events like a sports broadcaster shouting that the family was finally getting a baby, and a chorus of congratulations that flowed around me the way water skirts a stubborn rock, all while my sister watched my face with the brazen amusement of someone who has pulled the same trick since middle school and never once paid retail for the fallout. I smiled anyway, because I was raised by people who believed that a woman's real education happens in the space between what she feels and what she shows, so I hugged her and told her she looked radiant and pretended I didn't see the glance she tossed toward my fiancé, whose jaw tightened in that tiny, private way I know means he loves me and hates this, and I let the photographer take a shot where our heads touched, even though every part of me wanted to step back and ask whose party this was. And when our family stopped believing in simple things like letting one day belong to the person who planned it. Mom arrived at my elbow like a well-meaning tornado, whispering that I should be gracious because pregnancy hormones are real and my sister didn't mean anything by the timing. And Dad clapped my fiancé on the back hard enough to make him sway while announcing that life doesn't follow calendars, which I understood as the opening statement for the defense of my sister's entire personality. Meanwhile, the cake, our cake, with its simple white tears and the tiny sugar peonies I picked because I liked their quiet, was wheeled out without anyone singing to us, a detail I wouldn't have cared about on any other day. Yet tonight it felt like the final feather on a scale that had been tilting since we were children and had never once settled in my favor. I made small talk with cousins who complimented my dress while angling to touch my sister's stomach as if it were already a miracle on display, and I listened to my future mother-in-law say, in that patient, measured way of hers, that some people cannot imagine a room where they are not the headline, and I filed that sentence away because it would be useful later. The way you pocket a key you're not sure belongs to any door you own yet, but you keep it anyway because it feels like a promise. When the music finally softened and the photographer gathered people for a group shot that was 90% her, I slipped into the hallway where the air smelled like old wood polish and someone's cologne. And I leaned my back against the cool wall until my breath remembered how to behave, and I thought about every time I had been the understudy in my own life, the good sport, the team player, the one who cleans the kitchen while the confetti still fluttered down on her performance, and I told myself I was too old to rehearse that role again. I walked back in with a fresh smile and poured champagne for people who thanked me for being so supportive, and I laughed at jokes that made me tired, and I let the night pass over me like a wave I had already chosen not to fight. Because I had learned something better than fighting. I had learned that silence is not surrender when you are taking measurements. After the last guest left and the last dish hit the rack, I took the box of centerpieces to my car with my fiancé and listened to him cuss gently under his breath in that careful way people do when they are protective and furious, and I told him I was fine. Which was not true and not a lie, because I was not fine in the way a fire is not fine when it finds air, and he looked at me and saw the spark and nodded like a man who recognizes a weather pattern and knows to clear the deck. At home, my phone buzzed with a rainstorm of texts, congratulations to her, a few brave, I'm sorry, messages to me, one from my mother reminding me to be kind because a baby is a blessing, and I sat at the kitchen table under the good light, opened my laptop and pulled up the design my friend had mocked up for our save the date card, the one with the simple photo from the park and the line about joining us for a day we have waited for, and I made edits that mattered in small, surgical ways, shifting the font one shade bolder, nudging the date so it sat in the exact center like a heartbeat. adding a line that would answer questions no one had asked yet, but everyone would feel. I exported, proofed, and breathed. Then I built the list, checked the names, added the relatives who always say they never get things and the friends who rescue me when I do, and when the page asked me what I wanted to do next, I chose schedule. Because timing is everything in a household where applause is a limited resource, and I said it not for some distant afternoon, but for the next morning when coffee mugs are warm and inboxes feel like official records of what matters. I did not cry, because tears would have been charity I no longer felt like giving. Instead, I washed my face, climbed into bed beside the man who squeezed my hand without asking me to explain a single thing, and I stared at the dark ceiling until my eyes adjusted and the shapes resolved into something like a map, and on that map I drew a line from tonight's theft to tomorrow's announcement and felt, for the first time all evening, that the road belonged to me again. When the alarm hummed and the room turned the color of early tea, I reached for my phone without speaking, watched the clock slide toward the moment I had chosen, and listened to our quiet house hold its breath the way a theater does right before the curtain rises. And as the minute clicked over and the message went out to every inbox with our names on it, I smiled in a way that had nothing to do with forgiveness, because I was done being the rock the water schemes around, and for once I was the tide, and somewhere on the other side of town, before she ever thought to compose her next oops, my sister's phone lit up. Morning arrived with the gentle clink of the coffee maker and the smug little thud of 100 phones acknowledging a message that, for once, belonged to me. And while the city stretched and yawned its weekday into motion, my inbox came alive with the soft applause of replies that sounded like relief disguised as etiquette, cousins confirming the date, college friends using too many exclamation points because they knew last night had been a circus, my future mother-in-law writing the kindest sentence I have read in a long time about how grace does not mean silence and boundaries are a form of love, so by the time the toast popped I had already learned that, in the court of family opinion, people are braver behind keyboards than over cake. The first call came from my mother, who opened with a sigh that felt rehearsed and then reminded me, as if I had suffered a memory injury, that a baby is coming whether we plan around it or not, which was her charming way of requesting that I move my wedding down the calendar like it was a lawn chair on a crowded beach, and when I did not immediately perform gratitude, she pivoted into nostalgia about how sisters are forever, as though the word forever should include a fine print clause about always yielding center stage to the sister who treats attention like oxygen. I kept my voice level and said I loved her and appreciated the concern and that the date stands, which went over about as well as telling a referee I prefer my own score. The second call came stamped with my sister's name and a ringtone I had set years ago as a joke that had aged into a warning, and when I answered, she launched directly into a high-pitched lecture about how my email was tone-deaf and calculated. And I agreed with the second part because of course it was calculated. I had done the math right there at the kitchen table under the good light, and when she paused to inhale I told her that last night was supposed to be my moment and that sending a save the date for my wedding the next morning did not steal her anything, it simply returned what belonged to me. She laughed, the light kind of laugh that always precedes her meaner sentences, and said I was jealous and petty and probably infertile, which is the sort of grenade she lobs when she feels cornered, and for a heartbeat the room tilted, and then I felt my balance return because I remembered who was throwing and why. I did not meet her cruelty with cruelty, not because I am saintly but because I understand pressure points, so instead I thanked her for calling. Told her we would be sending out a wedding website later in the day with travel info and a few simple guidelines to help the night flow, and I let the word guidelines hang in the air like a slow bell, because my sister hates nothing more than a rule she did not write. She demanded to know what guidelines, and I said we are asking guests to avoid any personal announcements during wedding events, so we can keep the focus where it belongs, just as we will make sure the baby shower keeps the focus on her when that day arrives. And she said that was insane and controlling, and nobody would agree to that. And I said I trusted our friends and family to understand the concept of a door and a doormat. As soon as she hung up, because she always hangs up when a sentence corners her, my fiancé kissed the top of my head and opened his laptop while I opened mine, and together we treated the day as if it were a small company launch. Him drafting the logistics section while I wrote the tone, him confirming the block of rooms while I designed the FAQ, and when I typed the line that asked guests to please refrain from personal announcements, surprise toasts, or social media reveals during wedding events so the celebration could remain about the couple. I did not add a winking aside or a snarky footnote, because clarity is its own kind of blade. I also added a polite reminder that all toasts would be pre-scheduled and limited to a small circle, which would break my sister's favorite party trick at the neck, and I built the RSVP so that accepting required a small checkbox labeled, "I agree to the event guidelines," because nothing exposes the unreasonable faster than a reasonable sentence. By lunchtime the site was live. The link had gone out in a second. Cleaner email that thanked everyone for the warm response and included the line, "Thank you for helping us keep our wedding about the two of us," which was both a request and a mirror. And the replies rolled in like a tide that knew which shore it wanted to kiss, friends calling it brilliant, older relatives saying it was classy and overdue, a few brave souls making jokes about installing a confetti detector at the door, while my phone lit with texts from my mother ranging from worried to theatrical to that dire parental tone suggesting I was breaking the family, and all of it landed on me like rain on a coat I chose on purpose. For my own small satisfaction, and because petty can be tidy when it is honest, I called the photographer and ordered a clean mini-album of last night that featured exactly 2 people in every image, the 2 people who paid for the party and smiled through it. And I scheduled the gallery post for early evening with a caption that read, "We loved celebrating our engagement with you," a line so simple it felt like a needle that only the right skin would feel, and when I pressed schedule I felt that quiet tremor move through my shoulders, the one that says a small portion of balance has returned to the universe without requiring the universe to clap. Just as the afternoon settled into that soft hum that suggests you have made it through the loudest part, my future mother-in-law forwarded a screenshot she had received from a well-meaning friend who had no idea she was telling a secret to the wrong person. A screenshot of my sister in a private group chat asking whether anyone had thoughts on combining celebrations to be efficient, by which she meant folding a gender reveal into our rehearsal weekend because everyone will already be in town, and the image sat on my screen like a spark looking for oxygen, while I felt the familiar mix of anger and amusement rise together in my chest, and, before I could decide which one to name, my calendar pinged with a new notification from my sister, who had not called back, who had not apologized, who had sent me an invite titled, "Joint Celebration Planning, Quick Chat." The calendar invite sat in my inbox like a chipper little landmine. 15 minutes on a weekday afternoon, agenda unspecified, subject line pretending we were collaborators instead of crash victims and thieves. And while I understood that declining would ignite a fresh round of family diplomacy with my mother as the exhausted referee, I also understood that accepting would invite me to a stage where my sister believed she could improvise the rules. So I did the only thing that has ever worked. With her and with every other person who confuses loud with right, I accepted, but I brought an audience she did not expect, because there are meetings and then there are records, and I made sure this one would be the latter by adding my fiancé, our venue coordinator, and the hotel group sales manager, each of whom, God bless their contracts, enjoys a clear sentence more than they enjoy chaos dressed as charm. She arrived 5 minutes late with her camera off and her voice already sharpened, launching into a peppy monologue about synergy and family efficiency, and how everyone being in town for the rehearsal dinner created a perfect opportunity for a quick gender reveal, which, she chirped, could be tastefully inserted between dessert and dancing with a simple pop of confetti and maybe, if we were open to fun, a balloon drop, and in the silence that followed I could feel my fiancé's eyebrows lift, while the venue coordinator unmuted herself and delivered the kind of sentence that makes me believe in saints. For insurance and fire code reasons, the property prohibits balloons, confetti, powder cannons, live animals, indoor sparklers, and unscheduled amplified announcements, and any attempt to introduce these elements would result in a fee, an escort, and a permanent ban from returning to the property, which she conveyed in the polite tone of someone reading weather. My sister laughed as though we were all adorable fearmongers and then pivoted into the real tactic, which was to accuse me of being controlling and unsisterly for not offering to share the weekend. And I let her run until she reached the familiar crescendo where she names me selfish and herself spontaneous, at which point I thanked her for caring about family togetherness and shared that, in the spirit of togetherness, I had gone ahead that morning and reserved a bright, sunlit room at a lovely community space near her house for a dedicated baby shower, with a refundable deposit already paid in her name and a simple page of options she could choose from when she was ready, including a cake vendor who makes the kind of strawberry filling she likes and a florist whose pricing did not make me choke. And then I shared my screen so she could see the confirmation email with her name glowing politely at the top. Because if my sister understands anything, it is that preemptive kindness, delivered with receipts, is a kind of cage she cannot gnaw through without showing teeth in front of witnesses. There was a beat of absolute stillness, the kind that carries heat, and then she said that my gesture was presumptuous and insulting and that she would not attend any event she did not personally curate. And the hotel manager cleared her throat to remind us that our block contract included a small print addendum about outside events being promoted over the wedding weekend, and that sending announcements for competing parties to guests in the block could trigger penalties, and my sister responded by saying she had never intended to compete, which was true in the limited sense that monarchs do not compete with their subjects, and I, feeling the calm that comes when a plan clicks into its final notch, thanked everyone for their time, reiterated that we love the baby and look forward to celebrating it properly, and ended the call before my sister could gather enough words to turn the air blue. Because I believe in the gospel of follow-up, and because other people's memories soften like bread while paper hardens like glass, I sent an email to all present that summarized the discussion: no balloons, no confetti, no announcements during wedding events. Baby shower date held with love and flexibility, and I CC'd my parents, who pretend not to read while reading every letter twice, and I added a single request that anyone with questions contact me directly rather than reply all, which preempted my sister's favorite performance of rallying a chorus in the group thread, and then I did something petty and pure that would be invisible to anyone except the person it mattered to. I finalized the minimalist photo gallery from the engagement party and posted it quietly with the most basic caption imaginable, and I tagged only the vendors. Because nothing makes an attention addict itch like applause that is aimed at labor instead of personality. The responses arrived in soft waves, my aunt saying she had never seen guidelines stated so calmly, a college friend texting that I was handling her like a lawyer, my future mother-in-law inviting me to dinner with a tone that said sanctuary. And for an hour the house felt like a chapel with the door locked, until my phone cracked open with a string of messages from my sister that lurched from accusation to pleading to prophecy of family estrangement, which I allowed to stack up without reply. While I stood at the sink and let the water run over my wrists like cooling metal, and then the doorbell rang with the kind of insistence that suggests the messenger has mistaken urgency for authority. And when I opened it, she was on my porch with mascara fighting gravity and a printed copy of my email crumpled in her fist like a surrender flag she had no intention of waving, and she said, through teeth she held in a performative smile, that unless I rescinded the no announcements rule and released the shower date to her control, she would tell our relatives something I would not want told, a sentence that landed like a coin dropped down a well whose depth I had not measured. And while the echo traveled, I stepped aside and invited her in. Because nothing tastes sweeter than revenge conducted at a table set to record, and on the counter, under the good kitchen light, my phone already sat with the voice memo app open and the red circle waiting. She stepped over the threshold with that brittle smile that always means she has decided to audition for the part of victim while still directing the scene, and before the door had fully clicked she launched into the speech she had been rehearsing in the car. The one where my alleged coldness threatened the family brand and my rules, made me sound like a headmistress in sensible shoes, and just as my patience began to twitch she added the hook she wanted me to swallow, which was that unless I removed the no announcements guideline, and allowed her to craft something joyful. During the rehearsal night, she would share a story that would make people look at me differently and at my fiancé with new caution. A sentence so carefully sharpened that it pretended to be protective while aiming for the throat, and I realized she had come not to negotiate, but to rattle the cage around the one thing she knew I loved more than winning: the calm, ordinary future I have been building like a house, with windows that actually open. I gestured toward the kitchen not because I wanted to serve her but because, in my home, the overhead light is honest and the counter catches sound perfectly, and as she arranged her face into the pitying expression she uses when she is about to say something cruel, I set my phone down where anyone would set a phone and asked the kind of slow, neutral questions that always coax her into the truth she tries to hide, and in the unraveling that followed she said, in a tone of false innocence, that she had teased a few people about how my proposal was not exactly spontaneous because I had allegedly seen the receipt for the ring and hustled the timeline, and she added, with a syrupy little shrug, that she had once heard my fiancé had a fling with a coworker years before we met, and she implied that guests deserved context before promising forever, and she said these things the way she says everything dangerous, with her hands open and her eyebrows lifted as if the statements were butterflies that had landed on all our shoulders by mistake. I allowed silence to stretch until she filled it again, which she always does, and then I asked whether she would repeat the part about inserting her reveal at the rehearsal dinner, which she did. And I asked whether she considered last night's announcement at my engagement party to be fair play, which she did not deny, and when the final piece clicked, the admission that she had looped our parents into the plan because surprises are easier with an audience already warmed up, I felt the heat behind my eyes slide down into a calmer place where I think better. I did not call her a liar, because liars love that fight. Instead, I thanked her for sharing her concerns, pulled a crystal pitcher from the cabinet to pour water I had no intention of drinking, and said that her information about my proposal timeline was wrong and her rumor about my fiancé was ancient and irrelevant even if it had been more than office gossip, and that our guests deserved, above all, to attend a celebration without ambushes. And then, while she demanded details I would not provide, I clicked send on an email I had drafted in my drafts folder the hour after the calendar invite arrived, a tidy note addressed to the venue, the planner, the DJ, and the hotel manager, attaching a brief summary of our meeting and asking, in the politest tone available in civilized language, that any unscheduled announcements or disruptions be treated as an immediate breach of contract and handled by security quietly and decisively, with the understanding that the couple would be billed for the additional staffing, which, as the venue coordinator would later write back, was a request well within policy and frankly refreshing. Revenge, when it is good, does not gloat. It clicks into place with the soft sound of a drawer closing, and mine clicked 3 more times that afternoon as I followed the line I had drawn in my head. I sent out the final round of invitations with the event guidelines embedded as a required checkbox, which ensured that anyone who wanted the itinerary had to acknowledge the rules with their own finger. I asked the planner to place the microphone on a controlled switch so only pre-cleared toasts would carry, which left nothing for an opportunist to hijack except the bread basket, and I drafted a bright, generous baby shower invitation template using the same designer who had built our save the date, which I forwarded to my sister with a note that said the date and venue were hers to approve and that I would cheerfully transfer the deposit the moment she selected her preferred package, which meant that if she refused, the refusal would be her record, not mine. She called me manipulative, which I wore like a borrowed coat that, frankly, fit, and she tried to pivot back to her threat by asking whether I wanted people to discover on their own how my engagement had been engineered, which was when I realized the piece of glass she intended to brandish could be turned into a mirror, because what if the audience remembered last autumn's wine tasting where she had posted a very enthusiastic photo under a caption about sleeping late and living free? A harmless little moment with a timestamp that made certain math awkward for a woman claiming this pregnancy had been a surprise conceived during the holidays, and what if my mother, who can calculate a planting calendar from a glance at a fern, began whispering about calendars in the same kitchen where she had once defended spontaneity. I did not intend to blow up anyone's life, least of all a baby's entrance into it, but I understood that ambiguity is not my sister's territory. And planting a single question in soil she had salted with threats would grow faster than anything I could shout. I invited her to dinner at our parents' house for the weekend, not as a trap, but as a stage where I could finally decline to dance, and she agreed because she never turns down an audience. And I spent the next day straightening the table settings in my head and rehearsing the script that would keep me calm, a simple playback of our kitchen conversation. A request for boundaries in front of the two people who have always mistaken my politeness for permission, a presentation of the baby shower. Details ready for her signature, and a final line that offered peace in exchange for the smallest of mercies, namely, a wedding unmarred by announcements or rumors. And as I pressed my finger to the file on my phone to check the audio one more time, the front door opened to my fiancé carrying a small box from the planner that held the one indulgence I had allowed myself for the reception, a stack of sleek pouches with magnetic seals meant for phones, which would keep the dance floor lit with faces instead of screens, and would, as a pleasant side effect, make last-minute spectacle nearly impossible. And I slid one across the counter toward him like a playing card while thinking, not without humor, that I had finally learned how to host my own life. By the time Saturday arrived, the sky had settled into that respectful early evening, and my parents' dining room had been set with good silverware they reserve for diplomacy. And as my sister swept in with perfume that promised triumph and a smile that dared me to blink, I placed my phone beside my plate and watched my mother fold her napkin like she was preparing a flag for presentation. And when everyone found their chairs and the small talk ran out of places to hide, I reached for the device. Without fanfare, tapped the voice memo, and let my sister's own words fill the room with the precision of a courtroom clock, while my father's eyes narrowed by a degree I had only seen during tax season. And my sister reached for her water with a hand that finally trembled, and just as the final line played her promise to steal the weekend back, I stopped the audio and said, in a voice that did not need to rise, that I had brought a very simple paper for her to sign, which would pass the baby shower into her full control and confirm the wedding boundaries in writing, and she smiled with a defiance that had lost a little oxygen and said she would rather die than sign, which is when the doorbell rang and my mother, puzzled, rose to answer it, and returned with our venue coordinator standing in the doorway with a folder and an apologetic smile, saying she was in the neighborhood and thought it best to deliver one final document in person, a document with a clause my sister would not like at all. The coordinator stood on the threshold with that professional calm that never breaks unless the building is actually on fire, and when my mother waved her in with the nervous hospitality of a hostess whose table is suddenly a deposition, she set the folder down beside the roast and explained, in a voice that could talk a storm into taking the long way around, that the venue had prepared a short addendum at my request to protect the couple against disruptions, which translated, once you sifted the soft legal flour into a simple rule with sharp edges, any guest who attempts an unscheduled announcement or performance during a wedding event can be designated a disruptor by the couple or the coordinator on duty, after which security will escort them from the property, their room key will be deactivated, their access to hotel spaces revoked, and any additional gatherings under their name or booking number automatically canceled, with charges billed to the card most recently used to request services. And while she said all this with the soothing diction of a yoga teacher, her eyes made very clear that the clause was not theoretical, because the hotel, like the rest of us, prefers order to improvisation when candles and alcohol share a room. My sister insisted this was draconian and theatrical and probably illegal, and that no reasonable person would sign off on a policy that allowed the bride to ban her own family from the premises, and my father, who believes everything until it is typed, skimmed the paper and handed it back to the coordinator with a request for a pen, not because he enjoys conflict, but because he has spent a lifetime watching the same daughter sell chaos as charm, and something in him finally tilted toward ballast, My mother made a small sound that meant both apology and surrender, and she asked whether this was really necessary between sisters who once shared bunk beds and secrets, and I told her, gently but not weakly, that it would not be necessary if we could agree that a night planned to celebrate one thing would not be asked to carry another, and that nothing in the policy prevented joy. It merely fenced it so the roses could grow without being trampled. And then I turned to the person who had promised to steal the weekend back and said that I would prefer never to use the clause at all, but that I would accept the responsibility of having it. The coordinator asked for signatures from the couple and the point of contact family members because the hotel likes paper with minerals in it, not just sentiments floating over text chains. And while my fiancé signed without flourish and my father wrote his name like he was carving a narrow bridge, my sister pushed the paper away with a fingertip as though it might stain her, and she said, with breathy dignity, that she refused to be muzzled and would not submit to what she called my tyranny. A word that made my mother wince and my future mother-in-law, who had arrived quietly 5 minutes earlier and now sat at the edge of her chair like a woman observing court, lift her chin a degree and ask whether anyone would like dessert, which I understood as the adult version of a bell-dismissing class. I did not wield the recording like a sword. I let it rest on the table like a mirror, and I repeated, in a steady voice that carried no triumph because I have learned not to feed my sister a flavor she craves, that I had secured a bright venue and a generous deposit for a baby shower, and that I would transfer the date to her name the second she chose between the strawberry and the lemon filling, and that I would attend as a sister and bring favors and smile until my cheeks hurt if, in exchange, she would agree to keep our wedding events free of announcements and toasts that had not been scheduled, and I slid a very short document across the linen, 2 sentences only, a promise tied with ribbon, and waited. She laughed first. She always laughs first, even when the laugh sounds like a hinge that needs oil, and then she leaned back and delivered the monologue she must have crafted on her drive. The one where she described my relationship as transactional and my future marriage as a project management exercise, and she announced, with a martyr's shine, that she would not sign anything that made her less than whole, a phrase that, I will confess, scratched my patience raw, and when my father began to speak, she cut him off to say that she had already told a few relatives the real story of my proposal timeline, meaning the lie about receipts and rushed plans, which was when my future mother-in-law, who had been stirring her tea with militant calm, set the spoon down and asked whether my sister truly wished to spend the next several months swapping mysteriously sourced stories about calendars and conception math, because if that was the game, some of us owned calculators and knew how to count backward from holidays and wine tastings and time-stamped posts, and the room went very still in the way rooms do when a breeze becomes a wind and everyone remembers the door is open. I am not proud of the relief that passed over me then, because it arrived with a shadow that looked like loss, and what followed did not feel like a victory lap so much as a controlled landing at an airport that had been circling for hours, but the net result was clear. My sister stood up, cheeks bright with something that was not just anger, and she said we had made our choice, and that she would make hers, and she left without taking a plate, and my mother collected forks with the brittle hands of a woman who has held 2 daughters on opposite hips and never learned how to set them both down softly, and my father, after a long exhale, asked if the clause needed witnesses, which made everyone laugh in the sad way that keeps lungs working. Over the next days, the machinery of weddings ground forward the way it always does: final fitting, final playlist, final seating chart that turned into 3 seating charts, because families are living puzzles. And every time a doubt tried to creep in through some cracked window in my mind, I walked my own perimeter of choices and checked the locks. The mic would be on a switch only I could access. The staff would know where to look if an unscheduled show tried to sprout. The phone pouches would glow like small lanterns on a table near the dance floor. The guidelines checkbox would sit inside every RSVP with the weight of a silent oath, and the baby shower venue would keep the date on hold with a kindness that felt like faith in the ordinary. I did not plan a surprise, I planned a container, and I told myself that boundaries are simply shapes drawn around love so it doesn't leak into places where it can curdle. On the night itself, the room held The music threaded through us like a long ribbon. Our vows landed without competition. The toasts kept their lanes, and when we danced I felt the old ache of resentment peel away in thin sheets like sunburn. Not because I had defeated anyone, but because I had finally stopped asking chaos to play nice and had installed a fence. Only once did a ripple move through the floor when my sister arrived late wearing a dress that could have doubled as a thesis on martyrdom, and she stood at the edge with her hands on the small of her back as if the weight of the world had chosen her spine, and she watched our first dance with a smile that, if you didn't know the map, might have looked like grace. I never used the claws, not because I was afraid to, but because I did not need to, and when the night ended and people hugged me the way you hug a person whose life you hope stays exactly as happy as it looks in that moment, I sat on the edge of the bed in a quiet hotel room and read the message that had arrived while I was dancing, a message from my sister that began with a sentence I had never heard from her in those exact words and ended with a question I had been dodging for years. She said she would not sign my paper, but she would honor it. She said she would plan her shower and would not ask me to attend if my presence felt like a test I would fail. And then she asked whether I remembered a thing she had whispered to me once when we were small and shared a flashlight under one blanket, a promise about someday letting each other go first, and I did remember, with that ache that lives behind the sternum. And I stared at the screen until the letters blurred and the day's order softened around the edges, and I felt, with the kind of certainty that does not require applause, that my revenge had worked and that something more complicated had begun. And I couldn't tell yet whether it was a peace negotiation or the first quiet chapter of a distance that would one day call itself love and get away with it because we would both be too tired to argue.